Welcome, friends and comrades, to another interview segment hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Tonight, we speak with Professor Daniel Tutt about his recent book, How to Read Like a Parasite, How the Left Got High on Nietzsche. It is an excellent, erudite, yet readable work that develops upon the Lukács and Losurdo Marxist critiques of Nietzsche and bourgeois philosophical irrationalism in general, something we here at the Institute consider indispensable for challenging the various forms bourgeois philosophy takes. Daniel Tutt is a Marxist scholar and philosopher. His work examines contemporary Marxism, especially the work of Lukács and Alain Badiou, and he is interested in the resurgence of new forms of worldview Marxisms. He also studies and writes widely in psychoanalytic thought in the tradition of Freudian Marxism. He completed his studies in philosophy with the French philosopher Alain Badiou at the European Graduate School, and he studied as a graduate student in philosophy at American University. For the past 10 years, he has taught philosophy as a lecturer at various universities, including George Washington University, the Washington, D.C. Jail, and Marymount University. Much of his educational work is now focused on public-facing discussions and seminars through the Emancipations podcast and the study groups on psychoanalysis and politics, socialist-oriented platforms meant to offer accessible seminars and study groups for students, and specifically those who cannot afford access to quality material in today's university system. Tutt's first book was published with the Palgrave Lacan series in 2021 and is entitled Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family. It looks at how the proletarianization of the family is uniquely affecting the working class in today's time. The book examines the Freudian Marxist tradition and aims to reappraise many of the 1960s critiques of the family that emerged from older forms of Freudian Marxism, and in so doing examine how psychoanalysis can be useful for today's left in facing rivalries and splits and divisions. His second book is a reappraisal of Nietzsche from the lens of a long-neglected Marxist critique of Nietzsche called How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche, and it was published with Repeater Books early in 2024. This is the subject of today's discussion, but before we get into that, let us start off, as we always do, with the glorious Internationale. Alrighty, that's always a great way to start the day with the glorious Internationale. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us, brother.
Carlos, it is an absolute honor to be with Midwestern Marx for my first time, and long admirer. Watch so many of your programs, probably the majority of them. So, and it was wonderful to talk to you about the purity fetish on my Emancipations podcast recently. So, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for taking the book quite seriously and reading it very thoroughly. I really admire that, and I really appreciate that you did that based on what you told me already.
Oh, it was a pleasure reading it. As I tried to emphasize in the introduction, it's on the one hand a scholarly book, but a very readable and enjoyable read, which is two qualities that one often doesn't find. So thank you so much for writing that. But I wanted to get started.
Somebody's saying our books bleed into one another. That's kind of funny. I see that in the chat. It's true. It's like the same bookshelf.
Oh yeah, that's true. There you go. Let's have the same.
We are definitely Marxist nerds. We're
Yes.
the good kind. The
That's
good
true.
kind.
So Nietzsche's a figure we've never had the pleasure to touch here at the Institute. So before we get into any of the nitty-gritty stuff, can you tell us a little bit more generally about Nietzsche's life and work? How is Nietzsche relevant today, and how is Nietzscheanism pervasive in our society?
Yeah, most definitely. Well, first and most must be said that Nietzsche is probably one of the most important and most popular philosophers ever since he died 120 years ago. I think we can. It's always useful to start with a sort of a what we might call a political biography, given that Nietzsche has this sort of mysterious politics at the core of his philosophy. Nietzsche is born only 4 years before 1848, right? Before the Great Worker Uprising of 1848. Um, his father dies when he's a young boy, and this is a quite traumatic event. His father dies of some kind of mysterious brain disease. And Nietzsche is a highly precocious figure. He's born into kind of like definitely a upper crust, upper bourgeois family. His sisters marry top judges, and his father was very opposed to the uprising of 1848. He gets a full position as a professor of philology at the age of 24. So sort of a brilliant student. And so he flirted with theology, but becomes a philologist by academic trade. And around this time, he meets the famous German composer Wagner, Richard Wagner. And this, begins a lifelong artistic and philosophical relationship between the two. Although it must be noted that Wagner himself was very much in favor. There's that stupid thing again, Carlos. I don't know why it does that.
I've only ever
Um,
seen it happen with you. I think it's
I don't know. It's like some kind of like Eddie was saying, it's the CIA is inside of
there
my
you
machine.
go.
Anyways, so Wagner is sort of this like populist socialist, right? And he's sort of um, a figure that really welcomes what he calls the age of revolutions. But Nietzsche is writing at the moment when Germany transitions from being 35 mini states into what's called the Second Reich. Okay. And the rise of the Bonapartist. And we know Bonapartism is a very important concept in Marxist theory, which Marx develops in his text, The 18th Brumaire. And it refers to a particular form of bourgeois leadership, right? A particular form of political leadership that satiates the discontents of the working class from a kind of liberal bourgeois point of view. This is exactly what Bismarck tried to do. We know that Bismarck was kind of like a mild liberal reformer, but he was also a conservative. So he created these things called the anti-socialist laws, and he was obsessed with stamping down socialism. So one of the things that we understand about Nietzsche ever since his early first book called The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, what he concocts is a kind of aesthetic political project that is meant to, what I say, imitate the movements of egalitarianism and socialism that he finds all around Germany at the time, but pervert them towards a completely different form of community formation, a completely different sort of reactionary direction. So, in that sense, Nietzsche becomes a kind of antagonist to the movements of socialism, right? That's sort of one way to understand sort of like the thrust of his project. Another way to understand Nietzsche's philosophy is that he's a romantic. So he's coming out of the German idealist tradition, and he is what Lukács calls a great romantic anti-capitalist. So as a concept, romantic anti-capitalism is very important for us as Marxists to understand because Lukács teaches us that it is a particular form of an obscure mystification of a critique of capitalism. So you can think about it kind of like when this capitalist system goes into crisis, right? Part of the way to alleviate that crisis is to have members of the artistic and aesthetic avant-garde or bourgeoisie provide a critique of capitalism that does not change the material or economic relations of class, but rather creates a critique of capitalism from the position of a kind of bygone ancient culture, right? So we see this emerge in the literary scene of Nietzsche's time, and Nietzsche himself adopts a very similar position. What makes Nietzsche different, though, than your standard reactionary conservative, say like Edmund Burke, and this is very elusive of Nietzsche, is the fact that Nietzsche is not proposing that we restore a tradition of, like, say, the ancient Greeks by a nostalgic return to it. He rather argues that the task of his particular community formation is to sort of concoct an aristocracy of the future. And one of the things we realize is that Nietzsche, as a philologist, begins to become basically a historian of the French Revolution and of historiography, and he invents what he later calls the genealogical method. And the genealogical method is a sort of strategy by which Nietzsche seeks to concoct a series of concepts that I think we can understand as basically anti-revolutionary concepts. And I think over this conversation, we'll address some of these very popular ideas, like the eternal return of the same, the will to power, the pathos of distance, ressentiment, right? These concepts, Nietzsche, in some cases, is not the sole inventor of them, like ressentiment, but he becomes a popularizer of ideas and concepts. And part of the reason he becomes a popularizer is, of course, because he writes in a style which is very seductive. It's called an aphorism. So it's not like in Nietzsche, you don't really get a systematic philosophical exposition, right? You get a sort of veiled, esoteric, poetic style that is polemical and that is often quite bombastic to other philosophers, right? And to other traditions of thought. Nietzsche famously said that if socialism is achieved, basically man would no longer have the capacity for higher creative thought, or culture would die, basically. So one of the things that Nietzsche is sort of paranoid about is the success of the long arc of the revolutionary tradition, right? And the long arc of the revolutionary tradition he analyzes as stemming from Socrates all the way up to the French Revolution and its aftermath. He calls the French Revolution the first modern slave revolt, right? So Nietzsche is this thinker who incorporates a conception of politics which is robust and extremely, well, should be concerning to anyone on the left. And it's often, Carlos, I think the case, you probably know this, is that you wouldn't necessarily detect a lot of Nietzsche's politics just by reading him. You need to sort of get a better grasp of his context, of the historical context in which he's writing. And you need to sort of read Marxists and other philosophers that can put Nietzsche and Nietzscheanism, like the followers of Nietzsche, into a proper context. So that was part of what my book is trying to do, is to sort of fill a void. And you know, I know that you want to talk about this, but there is a certain void regarding how we on the left are to treat this figure. There's a kind of there's a big question there.
No, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. My first ever philosophy professor when I was an undergrad, I mean, I was the sort of person that hated school. I don't think I ever read a book until like my first few years of undergraduate studies. And it was my first class with my first professor where they asked me a question that actually forced me to think and not just recall something, where I just fell in love with philosophy. And I was like, oh, I got to do this for the rest of my life. But this individual was one of those that saw an elective affinity between Nietzsche and Marx. So Nietzsche was kind of always there as a sort of figure that for some reason I could never understand that most of the Marxist academics around me were pulling from. As far as the influence of Nietzscheism in society, I find it interesting. I wonder if you have the same experiences in your classes, but every semester I start, I do these little group exercises for people to get to know each other. One of the things that I ask is, are you familiar with any philosophers? Is there anyone that you have engaged with? And it's almost always the same three answers. There's like those that have already engaged with Marxism and say Marx. there's those that have gone down the Stoicism pipelines of YouTube, and they'll say Marcus Aurelius and Nietzsche. Nietzsche is always there in the mix within the two or three more popular ones. So, how do you think in a culture like ours that has so much moved away from reading, where, I mean, to get these kids to read 10 pages is a mission. How is it that it's so frequent to hear that they know of Nietzsche? Do you think people like Jordan Peterson have a role in that? And how do you see
Sure.
that in general, like the phenomenon of the Nietzscheifying of our society, or the influence of Nietzscheism in our society?
Sure. I mean, I do think that Nietzsche is not for everyone. That's must be said. Some people read Nietzsche and they have a kind of sense that doesn't feel right. But as I've written about, and I think this really stands the test of time, one of the things about Nietzsche that's very interesting is that if we put the aristocratic politics to one side, there is a youthful, rugged self-help dimension of reading Nietzsche that can actually, and I talk about this autobiographically for myself. One of the things that Nietzsche can do for you as a young person is basically assist you with overcoming an oppressive condition, whether that be like a broken family or a working class background or whatever oppressive realities you may be facing. Nietzsche is a thinker that is incorporating a certain level of inspiration. So a lot of his stuff is about self-overcoming and strength and courage and a kind of individual resolve. So I'm being very charitable to him on this level. But this is also a surface level reading of Nietzsche, right? And one can have a surface level reading of Nietzsche and kind of leave it at that. And you can sort of walk away, especially if you're reading like Walter Kaufmann or some of these translators who intentionally sought to remove the political core of Nietzsche. You can have that experience and he can like seize you. Like Mike Tyson had this experience when he was in prison reading. He read Nietzsche and he said that he felt like he wanted to be part of the higher man, the higher community, because Nietzsche's whole thing is calling you to participate in a future. You know, in Protestantism, they have this notion of the elect that comes out of the writings of John Calvin from Protestant Reformation, where there's basically at any given time in the Christian community, God calls forth an elect. Well, Nietzsche's notion of the Übermensch, or of what he calls the free spirits, or let's say more generally of the community that he's trying to concoct, is a secular version of the elect.
Mm. Well, by the way,
Nietzsche,
if I may interrupt real
please,
quick,
go ahead.
the comment on Tyson is baffling. I had no idea that was the case. I knew he read like Mao and Che and various communists in prison, and I think the Mao and Che tattoo that he has, I believe he got those in prison. So it's interesting that while he's reading these great communist leaders, he's simultaneously seeking this form of self-help thread out of Nietzsche, similar to like how Huey Newton, and we'll get into this later on, but and Jack London and other people would.
That's right. And part of this is an ethical question that Marxists should be aware of, that I want to make sure we broach carefully, because one of the things that's important to understand is that the Marxist critique of Nietzsche that I'm working with, that I've kind of tried to resurrect in my book, one of the consequences, Carlos, of this new reading is not the full annihilation or cancellation of him as like some kind of bourgeois, anti-socialist figure that must be forgotten about. But it's rather a humbling lesson regarding the depth by which Nietzsche himself read what we read. In other words, Nietzsche read everything he could about political economy. He read everything he could about the history of the French Revolution. He, according to Losurdo, the great Domenico Losurdo, who unfortunately died at way too young of an age, Losurdo says Nietzsche is more political than Marx, because Nietzsche politicizes domains of social life in his genealogical method that Marx would never dream of politicizing. Nietzsche's first book is a politicization of music. and showing how certain forms of opera are expressions of egalitarianism, for example. So we're dealing with a live wire political thinker who has an esoteric project that is imitating forms of socialist rebellion and trying to subvert those movements into some alternative to them, while at the same time being cunning enough to know that he's not necessarily going to succeed if he is directly for capitalism. This is what Lukács calls he's a great master of indirect apologetics for capitalism. And that ties into the romantic anti-capitalism as well. So we're dealing with a thinker who has, who must be confronted.
Yeah, I find Lukács's concept of indirect apologetics one of the most important to emerge out of the Marxist philosophical tradition in the 20th century. It's something that has been central for our understanding of the world and of bourgeois ideology and the various seemingly radical forms it might take in today's day. But can you talk a
And
bit
part of
about the
that,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just want to say one thing about that. Part of that's important is because Lukács will use this label of indirect apologetics for conservatives who have a knowledge of Marxism and socialism.
Mm,
James Burnham, who is a former Trotskyist, becomes the godfather of neoconservatism in the United
right.
States. But his immersion into Marxism gave him the tools to understand how to support capitalism better, precisely by providing a certain form of critique of capitalism. So things get quite complex insofar as we have ideological enemies, right? And Nietzsche is a clear ideological enemy to the cause of socialism and Marxism. And I think one of the problems has been, Carlos, as you mentioned, is that a lot of interpreters of Nietzsche on the left have felt uncomfortable assigning Nietzsche as an enemy to the left. And so that's been a big struggle of my book. And part of this, we can get into the history as to why that is the case. But the truth is, a lot of people, because Nietzsche touches them so deeply,
Mm,
there's an attachment disorder that happens that can be unhealthy. And they end up trusting him in ways which I think can be deleterious and problematic.
No, I would totally agree. Um, Especially because there's been not a lot of work within the communist tradition that mirrors what I think really pulls people into Nietzsche. And perhaps we can get to this in the latter part of the conversation because um, I wanted to bring it up with the focus on Jack London and Huey Newton. But can you talk a little bit about Nietzsche's revival via Walter Kaufmann? How does it
Sure.
participate in what Domenico Losordo calls the hermeneutic of innocence? Why must Nietzsche be read in his accurate political context, as you do in this text, as a thinker reacting against the egalitarian, universalist slash realist traditions of both the bourgeois Enlightenment and socialism? And what role does the Paris Commune, an event that he witnesses? He's of course a part of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and then the Communists the following year. So,
Yeah.
how is all of this taking shape in terms of his the politics that structures his work, and how is that
Right.
evolving with Kaufman and the hermeneutic of innocence?
All right, great. So let's start with Nietzsche's own time first, and then we'll go to Walter Kaufmann. So, as I mentioned, Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, is published right at the moment when the Second Reich is formed. Bismarck comes to power. Nietzsche has a sort of negative experience in the Franco-Prussian War. He's not a soldier. He does abandon his university post to participate, but it doesn't go that well. But as I already mentioned, The Birth of Tragedy brings out a critique of what Nietzsche calls the optimistic worldview. And this is a sort of condition of modernity that Nietzsche will stick with this concept for the entirety of his conscious years. And the optimistic worldview is he makes a kind of connection between it and the teachings of Socrates, Judaism, Christianity, Cartesian rationalism. So he creates this genealogy, right, of forms of, and then it culminates with Rousseau. As a side point, we should always remember that Marx spoke very fondly of Rousseau, right, and that Rousseau actually has a very central place in the tradition of political Marxism. For Nietzsche, Rousseau is the great, what he calls moral spider, and the great enemy to his community, precisely because of the form of equality that Rousseau and socialism is trying to bring about. So he references the Paris Commune as the saddest day of his life in a letter to one of his fraternity buddies. The saddest day of his life. It's actually interesting that he says it's the saddest day of his life precisely because the communists and the anarchists on the streets of Paris had a rumor had it that they burned down the Louvre, the famous museum, which was a rumor. It wasn't true. But that's actually a perfect way to connect Nietzsche's concerns with art and socialism. In The Birth of Tragedy, he references the communists and the working class that had the uprising in the streets of Paris as a saturnalia of barbarism. And he argues that the problem with socialism is that it's based on a philosophy of revenge. So he thinks that the movements of egalitarian leveling or revolutionary movements are problematic because they come from a class that is basically a neo-slave class. So this is one of the bold things about Nietzsche, which is that similar to Marx, but even more intense, is that Nietzsche is not afraid to call the proletariat an enslaved class. And we remember that Eugene Debs, even before the First World War, what did he say? He said, "Who will be the John Brown of wage slavery?" So you see, Nietzsche and Marx both have a kind of confrontation with the problem of wage labor as a neo form of slavery. One of the things that obviously differentiates Marx and Nietzsche on this matter is the fact that Nietzsche was unabashedly for the re-entrenchment and the redefinition of a new form of slavery. In other words, Nietzsche is for the proletariat. This is what's most insidious about him. One of the things is most insidious about him. The problem with socialism, in Nietzsche's eyes, is that socialists are trying to tell the proletariat that they should not be happy in this condition. And Nietzsche argued that the Greeks provided a theodicy, a justification of extreme suffering that we need to reintroduce into the modern period. Because the modern period and its optimistic worldview, as I mentioned a moment ago, is, I don't know why it's doing these balloon things. Sorry, man. Is precisely eroding the possibility of a stabilization of the social order. So this goes back to Nietzsche's Bonapartism. Nietzsche basically is a Bonapartist in principle. He's basically an extremist liberal, in the sense that what I argue Nietzsche's politics is about is the re-entrenchment, right, of a stabilized and harmonious social order in which the working class is pacified as an agency. And in that regard, you could not find something more anathema to Marxism than that, literally. So in that way, perhaps, to my other point, Nietzscheans today have a hard time with that fact because it's so monstrous. Maybe they can't live up to it. Like, for example, one of the most famous Nietzscheans of the right is this guy named Bronze Age Pervert. You may have heard of this cat. I read an interview with him where we know what he said, how he defines his politics. He says, "I define my politics as fascism or worse." Do you know why he says or worse? He says or worse because that's his reading of Nietzsche, which is similar to Ernst Nolte, the German historian, who said that Nietzsche's politics actually contains something that even Hitler shied away from. So we're dealing with a serious thinker that has serious ethical problems. Now, Bertrand Russell, the great English philosopher, called World War II Nietzsche's war. That's literally what he called it. And obviously you have Alfred Baumler, one of the top, next to Heidegger, Nazi intellectuals, who wrote a very important book on Nietzsche. Modern Nietzscheans will dispute the legitimacy of Baumler and so on, as they will, but what I'm trying to say is that it's undeniable that the Nazis appropriated Nietzsche. Marxists also appropriate Nietzsche, so it's not totally uh, it's not totally to say that Nietzsche's politics are reducible to fascism, by the way, because I think actually they're more Bonapartist. Okay. Anyways, the war ends. Supposedly the fascists are defeated. Walter Kaufmann is a German specialist at Harvard University in the 1950s, and he puts forward an argument because there were other German specialists in America that really wanted to kind of keep Nietzsche contained. Like there's a whole history of Nietzsche's archives in East Germany after the war, where the communists in East Germany, there was not one dissertation written about Nietzsche from when the war ended in the East German universities up until like the late 1970s. So in that interim period, you have the reintroduction of Nietzsche during the conditions of the Cold War. And Nietzsche is then introduced as a kind of libertine philosopher in particular movements in the West, from the libertarian socialist movement of 1977, the uprising in Italy, to the what Michel Cluscard calls the kind of libertarian leftism of May 68, right, in France. The philosophers of May 68, not exclusively, but primarily were Nietzschean leftism, right? So there's a very curious moment of the re-emergence of this philosopher, but dehistoricized and defanged and decontextualized, right, from the true roots of his political radicalism. And that's why most young people, when they read Walter Kaufmann, won't pick up on this history. So my book is sort of a reopening of this history. And it's kind of saying like, look, guys, did you know about all this? Like, it's worth knowing about all this, you know?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I just finished teaching Nietzsche myself, and I brought up your book quite a few times to my students. I hope a few of them check it out. But one of the things that I think you develop quite well in the book is the notion that part of or conjoined with the fact that Nietzsche is not this sort of neutral political figure, is the fact that his enterprise is kind of to build it's a community building project of sorts, that can really be thought of as something akin to a form of secular religion. This is an
Yeah,
argument that you pick up from Benjamin and develop on. What role does rank order and the pathos of distance play in this project? And if you can explain these terms somewhat
sure.
briefly so that the audience can understand them, please do
Yeah.
so.
Right. Well, Nietzsche saw the modern period as riven by socialistic impulses, right? So Nietzsche understood the threat of the left, the socialist movements, whether that be utopian socialism. I mean, there's an interesting thing, Carlos, which is that Nietzsche did actually know about Marx, because we know that he underlined Marx's name in his notes. And we know that Nietzsche read, there's a new book on Nietzsche's political economy by this guy, Safronov, and he read really widely. I mean, Nietzsche even has a theory of surplus. Okay. Um, the movements of socialism and modern massification, remember one of Nietzsche's main ideas, herd mentality, right? And that's why there's a certain radical individualism in Nietzsche. And everyone at a young age, when you know about Nietzsche, you know about the dangers of falling victim to the so-called herd mentality and so on. So there's a fundamental skepticism and anti-masses positioning at the core of all of the development of Nietzsche's concepts. And one of the things that Nietzsche says about our time, the modern time, is that we have lost what he calls the pathos of distance. The pathos of distance is a very important idea, which is at the underbelly, at the heart of Nietzsche's core objective, which is the restoration of a culture that can produce great genius individuals, Lacerda says that Nietzsche's philosophy is built around the preservation of what he calls the metaphysics of genius. So when you read Nietzsche, part of the effect, especially as a young person, and this is kind of why he's so alluring, is you sort of feel like there's only 5 or 6 geniuses in my city, and I happen to know them. Maybe there's only 1 or 2. That's the effect of reading Nietzsche. You really feel lonely, and you need to find other rare free spirit geniuses, right? So there's a hardwired anti-masses conception there. Now, one of the things about the pathos of distance is that Nietzsche says that all great civilizations retain what he calls pathos of distance, which is the enactment of forms of division, which are both physical, but also could be cultural, intellectual, that are kind of like apartheid. It's kind of like the cultural normalization of structures of apartheid, in which class distinctions of rank are not questioned. So you see, this is the radicalism of Nietzsche, right? Which is socialists are a problem because they question rank. We're not content with class. We have a problem with class. We want to abolish class. Nietzsche's he says, my philosophy is best understood as a philosophy for the preservation of rank order, not individual morality. He says that at one point. So, therefore, in his later periods, what Nietzsche will introduce is a category of physiology. And here it's quite interesting because what Nietzsche is really arguing, and this is why a lot of these right-wing Nietzscheans are obsessed with things like IQ, you know, which I think as socialists, we should always reject these forms of ranking people along these lines. There's that stupid thing again. Sorry, guys. You see my point? Like, because what Nietzsche develops in his later period, this is why Nietzsche is considered one of the godfathers of the eugenics movement, is the idea, and there's a certain radical Darwinism here too, by the way, of the annihilation of degenerate races. And therefore you have the development of a certain perverted and insidious cosmopolitanism that is based almost on what I call a kind of hyper-meritocracy in Nietzsche's eyes, where this kind of Übermensch, what he calls the good Europeans, can rise above the herd and concoct a society in which their leisure time, their otium, is not questioned by those below them. That's Nietzsche's ideal society. It just so happens that society is very compatible with what Elon Musk would desire, with what kind of entrepreneurial capitalism would desire. So I'm reading Nietzsche to his intentions, to the letter. Now, let me be clear. We can also, we can read, like we talked, Carlos, in our last interview, we can read him like a scalpel. We can read him like a parasite, where we don't accept it all. We don't say, yeah, our politics is fascism or worse, like Bronze Age pervert, right? So that's a whole other thing, and that's what we call reading methods. We can come up with a different reading method, right? And that's part of what my book is trying to do.
And I think it's an essential enterprise for Marxists if we not only divorce ideas from the larger context of the intellectual production of the author from the other ideas in which they're embedded in, but also divorce them from the economic context, the cultural context, the historical context that produced them. What we're engaging with are facts that are castrated from the factors that produce them. And I think that, central to that hermeneutic of innocence that's employed by many in order to justify that attachment to Nietzsche is this systematic reification of various ideas of his, and that seems to be the condition for doing so in a very not self-conscious way, because you can read like a parasite, take a thing here and there, but you're part of what you're doing. And as I understand your reading method, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but part of what you're doing is recognizing that you're taking parts, and you understand what you're taking in the context of why it is that you have to take that and leave something else. And we have a way that we refer to that similar reading pattern at the Institute, and it comes from just the Marxist understanding of how he relates to Hegel. There's a rational kernel that's taken and a mystical shell that's left behind of sorts. And I see a lot of homologies there between that, which the folks in the audience are probably tired of me repeating over and over again every stream, and the reading method of reading like a parasite. But to get back to some of the reinterpretations and contextualizations that you're providing for some of the key concepts, the sexier concepts in Nietzsche, things like the eternal return and ressentiment, how are they essential tools for his political project that, as you mentioned, is fundamentally rooted in naturalizing hierarchy, oppression, and the working classes suffering?
Sure. Well, first off, let's take ressentiment. It's a French neologism that is basically referring to a form of political resentment, which is qualified at a higher level than mere resentment. It already existed with Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, for example, analyzes the condition of ressentiment as almost like a general condition of what he calls the age of reflection, right? Which is kind of the post-French Revolutionary age. But Nietzsche analyzes ressentiment in a way which is transhistorical more so, and is more politically incorporated into his wider project. And for Nietzsche, there does emerge what he calls a kind of recurring the men of ressentiment, right? There is a kind of, and sometimes he even associates this with what we would today call the working class, or what Marx would call the proletariat, what Nietzsche in Human All Too Human would call the impossible class. So there is a certain homage to a class formation of that is almost like a condition. And I think in philosophical terms, what's problematic about this, and I get into this, I think this is like the part of my book that is the most, perhaps one of the most contemporary, especially now, Carlos, that we have all of these books coming out by liberals about the so-called rural problem. Are they fundamentally racists? Are their politics fundamentally of resentment, for example? And I think what's interesting about for Nietzsche, right, is that in some sense, what Nietzsche is trying to concoct, and you see this in his later work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is a philosophy for his followers that would actually be about the transcendence of revenge. So at the core, there is, like many things with Nietzsche, there is a kernel of a kind of noble task, you could say. Nietzsche puts a huge onus and a huge impersonal barrier struggle that must take place to fully overcome the feeling of revenge that's inside of us. And the reason that there's a feeling of revenge is because the systems of thought, the optimistic worldview of Christianity, of socialism, of Socratism, of Rousseauism are all themselves philosophies of revenge, right? And that actually goes back to Nietzsche's critique, his early work on the problem of Socrates. And part of that also has to do with the idea that dialectics, Nietzsche reads Socrates as kind of one of the godfathers of dialectics, as a mob philosophy, as the expression of the masses coming into touch with the universal, right? So any doctrine that would promote the notion that morality or virtue can be taught to all is itself to be questioned by Nietzsche, precisely because it does not adhere to this, what we talked about before, the pathos of distance, right? So in a certain way, ressentiment is a polemic. It's a polemical device, and it has a certain function. And its function is basically to shut down forms of resentment within a political sequence. And I think this, Carlos, introduces us to a real question. This is where Nietzsche gets us thinking. This is where Nietzsche becomes a parasitical figure that we have to grapple with, precisely because what he's encouraging us to think about is the extent to which, resentments, negative affects, and so on should be valid sites for political contestation.
And I think actually that resentments, especially resentments born from capitalist exploitation and labor exploitation and economic disadvantage, which of course includes racial oppression as well. I'm not excluding that. But those forms of complaint, for Nietzsche, he wants to cover all of those over in some sense. You know, he doesn't want those to be elevated to the side of political rhetoric and discourse. And that's actually why you see a lot of Nietzscheans on the left and the right, when they use ressentiment, there's a certain desired effect of using it, which is to shut down any form of complaint of injustice. And this actually leads to really crazy things for left Nietzscheans. Like, for example, you'll see left Nietzscheans argue things like socialism, even in a liberated society, no longer needs to deal with things like rights, the discourse on rights, or like, you know, the rights of man from the French Revolution. All of that will keep us mired in forms of resentment, for example. So you see, the problem that I have with this ressentiment structure is it takes it way too far. It's a kind of, it's an ultra politics in some sense. And we can talk this through. I don't know what your thoughts are on it. I'd like to actually see what you think about it.
Yeah, it's very interesting because we talked a little bit about this on your channel, because I do have a short section in the purity fetish where I make the I make the argument that there is a form of petty bourgeois resentment in the Western Marxists, that because of their impotence, their inability to achieve socialism, when the doctrine, the very doctrinaire, dogmatic form they read Marxism says they're supposed to be the first ones. They look at the fruits of socialism in the East and in the global South, and they say, no, that's not actually socialism. It's not real socialism. So it's a similar transvaluation, a turning on its head of like the valuative order that's in the world on the basis of their incapacity, impotence, and actually living up to it. It's the fox and the sour grapes example, where, for those that don't know Aesop's fables, the fox jumps and jumps and jumps, can't grab the grapes, and then on the basis of that impotence, it says, well, they're probably sour anyways. I think that there's a possibility for that reading, because primarily when I look at these people, they seem to be motivated by something deeper than just an ideological flaw, like the purity fetish. There's like a surplus there, an emotive surplus, that just bringing about any conversation about actually existing socialism just gets them going crazy, in the same way that like someone that's broiling over envy and impotence would. But we also discussed that that there's other interpretations of resentment, and I think you point out some of these in your text, that can see it as a positive creative force for the working class. And I believe I mentioned when we spoke that one of our philosophy instructors that is a researcher for the Institute, Sebastian Leon, he writes out of Peru, and when Pedro Castillo came to power, the cosmopolitan petite bourgeois left, their main intellectual came out with an article calling Pedro Castillo's primarily rural, socially conservative movement a movement based on resentment. And Sebastian's reply was, yeah, this resentment is a positive creative force. It's something produced by the system and can be used positively. And there was a interesting back and forth of articles there. But one of the, I think, distinctive things that comes out of your text is that central to this trans-historical treatment of resentment is the fact that it ends up operating almost like an ontological classification of a certain group's inferiority, an inferiority that's not seen to be rooted in some environmental context, but in their very being. And what that got me thinking of was the way that MOK describes racism.
Yes.
In one of his sermons, he says racism is fundamentally an ontological affirmation. It's an affirmation of a group's inferiority in their very being, not just because of an environment or something, like the inequalities that exist or something that are in the very being of a specific group. So how would you read the sort of relationship that exists there between the ontologizing of resentment in Nietzsche
Yeah.
and various forms of racism that are obviously in the air that
Sure.
Nietzsche's intellectual production is coming from.
It's a brilliant question, Carlos. I mean, you're really hitting at the heart of so much good things here. And Domenico Losurdo can help us because he invents this very important concept to understand how race links into ressentiment, by the way. It's a bit of a fancy concept term, but if you guys can bear with me, Losurdo calls it transversal racialization, which means you can go back to what I said about pathos of distance. So Nietzsche concocts a world vision, a vision of society that is divided. Nietzsche is always a thinker of the two. He says that his philosophy comes to split the world in half. And he says that society must be constructed or should be constructed off of an ascending and a descending line. And what that means is basically that the market in a capitalist society will determine the winners from the losers. And so racialization can function transversally based on either the losers or this kind of vague category of the others, however you then deem them, right? So, for example, Wendy Brown, the Berkeley professor, has a book on neoliberalism where she argues that, I guess, she thinks that white men in America after the Second World War, after deindustrialization, right, have a ressentiment. So they are resentful over the loss of their supposed privileges in the, Keynesian period of the welfare period. And so while that may be true, okay, what I think is problematic about what Brown says is basically that she kind of racializes them in some sense. And I think that's opposed to the Marxist analysis of race and class. Because one of the things we know is that class is a social relation. It's not an ontology. And actually, I think we get into hot water and we get into dangerous political fields when we render it that way. So, because when we ontologize the other like that, what have we done? We've shut down the possibility of solidarity with them. That's why I believe that on the left in America today, we've had these forces acting for decades to divide us. And solidarity is the name of the game. So any theory of class or race that's going to ontologize a group like that, I'm not for it. Because I would rather work like this is in my debate with Haas. Like, we were talking about MAGA. Yeah, like my family's MAGA. Like I'm on the left. I work with professionals and most of my friends' families are not MAGA. I'm unique in that regard. But do I want to convert MAGA to socialism and communism? Of course I do. But when I ontologize them as some kind of static thing, there's nothing that can be done. So you see my problem. This is my problem with ressentiment. I hope that that's clear.
Yeah, absolutely. As I was reading your commentary on Brown's book, I kept coming back to the same thought, and it's a fairly popular one for the liberal elite and their ideologues to describe part of the MAGA movement as just very akin to how the cosmopolitan elites in Peru were talking about the rural proletariat that was behind Castillo. And in the conversations I've had with Sebastian, I think we've discussed some of those overlaps and this very cosmopolitan petty bourgeois.
So you know this gentleman.
Yeah. He writes for us.
That's amazing, man. That's amazing.
The one that was replying, defending resentment.
Yeah, that's amazing.
He's one of our writers and has been for quite some years. I think we covered that topic, specifically the homologies of that with the MAGA movement. And I think that what certain groups, including ourselves and perhaps Infrared, see, even if it's with some differences, is that there is a potential there um, rooted in that dissatisfaction. So it's in a way a turning away from this understanding of resentment as a force that cannot produce something creative
Yeah.
and
I mean, I
progressive.
think it's what I like to consider it is passivity. And this is what I think Huey Newton of the Black Panthers really saw as well, which was it's not so much an ontology of a condition that you are conditioned to when you are a working class person, or when you are, let's say, like a racialized person, or when you are oppressed. Because if that was true, then like Nietzsche would be totally victorious. But we don't want Nietzsche to be victorious, because we kind of already know that he sort of wants the lower class to be pacified, right? And in fact, Nietzsche actually, if the lower class is pacified, he's like, let them be happy, let them be mediocre, let them be mediocre. That's actually a very crucial point, which is Nietzsche's anti-universalism. Okay. One of the consequences of that is that he's fine with the subjugated class remaining in mediocrity. And actually, that's why I say that socialism must be for mass excellence.
Mhm.
But I'm only saying that because I'm reversing Nietzsche, you see.
Yeah.
And I think, somebody like Huey Newton kind of did the same thing. I mean, I could tell the story very briefly if it's of use, but basically, Huey Newton is born into a left-wing family. It's actually named after Huey Long, the great socialist populist leader. Parents are educated. He's surrounded by books as a young man. And so he reads really widely. Plato, he reads Marxism very deeply, and he reads a lot of Nietzsche. And one of the things that he argued, obviously, that the Panthers argued, is that one of the impediments in the post-civil rights, like after the achievement of Martin Luther King's sort of congressional or legislative success, right, is that there still remains a passivity amongst the Black proletariat that needs to be activated. And so what I show in the book, building off the work of others, is that Newton reads Nietzsche to help depacify the Black proletariat. And that's actually something that Nietzsche can give to the left in a positive way, which is, if this condition of resentment is causing a kind of interminable passivity, well, the question is then how do you energetically break people from that condition? And one of the things that Nietzsche teaches is that language and truth is one of the reasons why Nietzsche is known as the godfather of postmodernism. There's an early text that Nietzsche wrote called On Truth and Lying in an Extra Moral Sense, where he argues that truth is really a kind of army of metaphors and metonymies, and that words have a kind of fundamentally fictional quality when they latch on to us as values. And so Nietzsche understood the kind of flexible and fungible basis on the means by which we invest into political words and ideas. So Huey Newton took the example of how the Black proletariat invested into the word cop. And his conclusion was that it rendered their authority relationship, usually to white cops, sometimes Black cops, as passive. So you reading Nietzsche, he said, wait a second, what if we change that word? And so the Panthers invented the idea of calling cops pigs. And I show that they invented this partially from reading Nietzsche. So whenever you call a cop a pig, you can thank Nietzsche, which is fucking crazy if you think about it. And it's also further proof that, like, we got to know about his agenda, but we can't cancel him because he can help us derive these things. Whatever you may think about the notion of calling cops pigs, whether that's successful, that's another question. But you see what it's trying to address. It's trying to address what we want to address, which is we want to politicize certain domains of political life that liberalism doesn't politicize, right? Like we want to politicize things like class because we think that it can do a positive thing, right? It can build something. There's a way to read Nietzsche that could sort of help you politicize domains of social life, because he understood about these complex ways that we invest words and values and bodies and affects. Like So there's a certain richness of Nietzsche that can be gleaned for socialism.
Right. Yeah. And I think if one sustains, which this is something you hammer out throughout the book, if you sustain like a proper Marxist class analysis, there's, the danger's kind of evaded. But what often ends up happening with that is that it very easily turns into like a postmodernist / idpol form of micropolitics, where it's just like you feel like you did the deed simply because you used the word, and
Right.
it's evasive to certain projects, mass projects of a more macro, socially transformative forms of politics.
No, you're totally right. I mean, this is why we cannot allow the left to be purely Nietzschean. That's why I always say, whenever anyone wants to put Nietzsche in the driver's seat of the main philosopher of the left, it's these kind of dangers that happen. And why I also believe that without a healthy dose of class analysis, precisely because Nietzsche wanted to excise class consciousness entirely, I actually think, Carlos, there's a correlation between these French theory people trying to move away from Marxism as a form of class consciousness and Nietzscheanism. Because Nietzsche has a thorough critique of consciousness as a category at the foundation of his philosophy. So if you incorporate a left project where Nietzsche is your inspiration, you will not adequately deal with the problem of working class emancipation, in my opinion. That's why the Nietzsche-Marx rapprochement needs to be done very carefully, and why even Nietzschean Marxism as like a hyphenated thing where you combine the two needs to be rethought, in my view. I mean, that, but that's like my kind of warning to the left, There's a certain danger that comes with that fusion.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, as you mentioned in the book, with figures like Jack London and Huey Newton and others, it's I guess it's kind of easy to think, well, the left that we're talking about here is one that is simply just like the sort of compatible left that's mass produced by the academy, the sort of left that we get with like the Congress for Cultural Freedom that has an explicit purpose to divert attentions away from a Marxist class analysis. That's what Michael Parenti called a ABC theory, anything but class theory. And that ends up functioning as what our friend and comrade Gabriel Rockhill called radical recuperators, where they just end up taking the dissenting attitudes of people and folding them into a pro-imperialist fold, and ultimately become what I label like agents of a controlled counter-hegemony. But it happens at that level of the academy and the NGOs, and it's kind of produced there, but it trickles down. And I think that the fact that proletarian leaders like Huey Newton were engaging with this should be a sign that it's important to have these debates, because I mean, for people that are just on the ground organizing, it might be difficult to think about, well, what's the point of talking about Nietzsche for communism? Who are these leftist academics? But these ideas trickle down, and they're so deeply rooted in our cultures that it's Gramsci used to say something that I agree with, which is that the battle of ideas, I mean, you're not going to win it if you're approaching a certain type of idea in its least coherent, popularized, massified form. You need to approach it in its most coherent, most developed form, beat it there, and then you have created the arsenal to beat it in all the other forms that it popularizes into. And I think that's something that you do quite well in your book here. But to shift us into a discussion we have hinted at already, there's a quote from your book that I very much appreciated. There's quite a few, but there's one that I wanted to base a question around, where you say that some version of self-help discourse is necessary for left leadership and political organizing. And as someone who comes from an athlete background and who's still like a gym rat of sort, I'm always engaging with this sort of material, like Goggins screaming at my ear, "One more rep," or Tom Platz, "Kill me, do do more fucking, do more reps. And it is sort of motivational. And I think that there is a superficial reading of Nietzsche that kind of reduces it to that is something we see in like Jordan Peterson and stuff. And we have developed as the left, I think, in conjunction with the purity fetish, there's been something derivative of it that scholars like Michael Parenti, De Sordo, and Jones Monod out of Brazil have pointed out, which is that there's a form of fetish for defeat. And I think that this has led to a reaction that any form of self-help, like grab life by the balls and let's do this thing attitude is kind of just automatically dismissed as bourgeois. Like what comes to mind is like these bourgeois self-help videos that I agree are important for entrenching bourgeois ideology. But like, one of the things that our institute has tried to do really from the start is try to capture like a communist variation of this, because we think it's important to have these forms of motivation. And Che Guevara, in one of his speeches to the communist youth, he says something very interesting, especially, you know, for if anyone's listening coming from a conservative background that knows the assumptions about communism and the hatred of competition, all that stuff. He tells the young communist league, La Juventud Comunista, he says, you have to strive to literally be the best. Be the best. Be the best in the classroom. Be the best in whatever it is you're doing. Not in a way where you're bringing others down. Help others, lift others up, but strive to be the best. Strive to, as you said, I think quite eloquently in that conversation you had with Haz, strive to exuberate excellence, to embody the sort of society that we want to create in your very form of being. And in doing that, you're going to be, as Noah has argued in some of his works, walking the walk and allowing people to see, okay, this is something new that I think is going to help me more as a human being. If this is a sort of society, if this is a sort of person fighting for socialism, this is something I can get behind. Right. I've tried to think about it as a form of communist virtue ethic. Again, a kind of twist on Aristotelian virtue ethic. But it seems to be something that's necessary, and that from what I get from your reading of Jack London and Huey Newton, that is a similar question that they're asking themselves.
Right.
So how important do you think this question is tackling it? How do we create like this sort of excellence culture, but that's communist and proletarian rooted and universalist and not elitist?
I mean, it's true. I mean, when Jack London was invited to be a propagandist for Eugene Debs's Socialist Party, he would give speeches at elite bourgeois institutions, and he would recognize that bourgeois politics didn't have an antagonism. And so he would say, we are socialists, fight us. If you agree with us, come fight with us. If you disagree with us, fight against us, right? But fight us. And he was well received, right? Even in these elite institutions. And Jack London is, I mean, one of the things that happened after the Floyd uprising is in Oakland, people wanted to tear down the Jack London statue because they thought he was a racist. And to some extent, he is a victim of his time. There is a certain problematic racism from this kind of neo-social Darwinist milieu that he was in. But at the same time, as I researched his biography, I also realized that London is more complex on the race piece, in part because when he made a bunch of money from his popular novels, like White Fang and all those novels we know him by, because he grew up in abject poverty, by the way, he basically bought a home for an African-American woman who helped raise him. So there's a certain redeeming quality of Jack London that I think is worth us revisiting today, in part because of, as a historical figure like Upton Sinclair and other figures around that time of the pre-World War I, Second International Marxism, which I think intellectually presents so many relevant lessons for us as we are trying not to do what these left Nietzscheans were trying to do in the 60s, which is tear down the party form and do this kind of self-overcoming sort of radical subjective thing. If you think about our conditions that we face as a generation after the great economic crash, if anything, what we need to do is build up a certain strength, resolve, organizational capacity. And in that regard, virtue matters, right? Like constructive engagement with others, propagandizing for socialism, education, forming connections locally, doing actual organizing work, right? Incorporating rigorous study groups. Like all of this stuff is about a constructive self-help to some extent, precisely because people are no longer going to be attracted to the kind of kind of bourgeois infantile stuff that a lot of this left Nietzscheanism was associated with under the rubric of what we call May 68 or French theory. So I argue that our era is kind of outgrown a lot of that 60s philosophy. So therefore, we can treat Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche is a thinker who said, my philosophy will exist for the next 2,000 years. And he also said that my philosophy will not truly triumph until after great socialistic wars have taken place. So Frederick Engels predicted the war, the First World War. Obviously, he died long before it. Not only did Nietzsche predict the First World War, he said, my philosophy will only take place after great wars, plural. Then he said, you see my point. So like it or not, this thinker, and I even have studied Islamic Nietzscheans like Muhammad Iqbal, who actually thought that Nietzsche did have a sort of touch with prophecy. I don't think that he had a touch with prophecy, but the point being is that he's trying to create what does he address his audience to? The philosophers of the future. So that's why I say that we are Nietzsche's children, right? Nietzsche tries to invent a certain direction that politics, culture, and social life can take. And so therefore he will always remain with us in our lifetime and beyond. The question is, how do we learn from him? And I think you raised an interesting point on this self-help piece. I mean, Alistair McIntyre is another thinker who wrote After Virtue, which was a Marxist contribution to virtue ethics that everyone should read. We should do study groups of this text, right? Written right at the moment when neoliberalism becomes fully concretized, because virtue ethics is, I think, what is Marxism is not an anti-morality, in my opinion, and nor is it a Kantian version of ethics. But I think it's, if we wish to talk about what ethics Marxism needs, I agree with you, Carlos, that it is something like virtue ethics. And virtue ethics have to be eminently considered, right? There's a certain, and Alain Badiou, my mentor, he's huge on this, right? At any given time, a virtue ethicist will identify and prioritize certain virtues over others. So for Badiou, it was the virtue of fidelity to the revolutionary event. Even though the revolution is waning in his time, even though he sees our world as one in which liberalism is totally won and communism is in retreat, we have to have fidelity to communism. So the question for us is, what's our virtues? What do we prioritize? And that's something that we should study and figure out.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it is one of the areas of research that I'm currently undertaking. There's not a lot of research out there on this area. But I do think that if we are to think about a form of communist morality, it definitely would be within the line of like the virtue ethics tradition. And I mean, there is some scholarship that points to how even in Marx's more speculative, and I use that not in a Hegelian sense, in a more quotidian sense, comments about how communism would look like, it looks very akin to the sort of society that would create the conditions for the greatest amount of human flourishing, a la Aristotle.
Yeah.
And that's It's almost as if the communist individual looks something like Phil from Groundhog Day. At the end, the transformed Phil, which is something that I've written on. Where I mean, you get that passage from the German ideology. You go hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon. You do critique at night. Like you do all these. You're a multifaceted individual with these complete.
Yeah, that's why Nietzsche once said that his followers should adhere to the social order as stones, not as actors. And I thought to myself, given that the title of our presentation tonight is Marx or Nietzsche, this is a perfect example of Marx over Nietzsche, precisely because even though Marx said very little about what communism will be, one of the things we know is that communism will not and cannot be, and this actually relates to the question of bureaucracy, and something that Nietzsche teaches us in a negative lesson. Like everything in Nietzsche, you learn dialectically through like negating it. And this is an example precisely because Marx's idea of communism, as I understand it, is about an achievement of a domain of social life of a radical freedom in which rigidity of ranking is not functioning as it did in capitalism. Now, capitalist rank is a mysterious or elusive form of rank because capitalism, even though the liberals like to tell us, is actually a quite hierarchical system, right? And I think as socialists, we need to reveal the false hierarchies of our world. And one of the false hierarchies of our world for working class people is the kind of collapse in the promise of meritocracy. But in that collapse, I think it's very important as socialists, as Marxists, even if we are from modest backgrounds, we still transpose our own version of meritocracy outside of the standard path. That's why I really like what Midwestern Marx is doing, because you guys are not doing this for financial remuneration or even for personal recognition. You're doing this for the cause of something much greater than that. And that's an example of excellence and the transposition, of this liberal version of meritocracy, which is so individualist. How do you break from that? Well, it's very easy to do so if you have something that you truly believe in. You stay up all night on streams and you talk about things and you meet with comrades and you organize and you learn, right? So that's not, I don't even want to call that meritocracy because that's a liberal word, but it's something unique. Maybe we should call it something more virtuous. I don't know. I'm not opposed to that.
Yeah, especially at a time when there's such a deep crisis of meaning in our societies. Something I think signified by the rampant rates of depression, anxiety, and different forms of mental health issues. And I imagine that the numbers are always a bit lower than what they are because so many of us, especially men, find it hard to describe these sorts of experiences. It is, I think, with the meaningfulness that you get when you're committed to a project that is well beyond yourself, a project that is even well beyond, your family or anything immediately surrounding you, not in a disconnected way that's incorporated within it, but the sort of grand historical project for humanity, which is, how we think of what socialism is, an advancement of humanity forward into a freer, more democratic society. I think that's it creates the conditions for the possibility of the greatest amount of meaningfulness in one's life, and it gives you a life project that even if you don't achieve it, you feel complete because you have moved the generation ahead of you or the one ahead of them to a stage in the fight that's much further along.
Exactly. And in that process, I think what Nietzsche would say, because what did Nietzsche worry about? He said socialism achieved would eradicate the possibility of individual genius. That's actually why I say at the end of my book that Nietzsche is a parasitical bourgeois form of individualism, Nietzscheanism is, such that when we fully overcome capitalism, we will have overcome this form of Nietzscheanism, okay? Because that's what Nietzsche wants. He wants a small cadre of elite geniuses to bask in a certain exemption. Nietzsche said that anyone who has to work and take orders for like under half of the time of their day is basically still an enslaved person.
Mm.
This is actually why a lot of Nietzscheans are have a very troubled relationship to work, and that's why they have this dream, you know, this ideology, Carlos, of the entrepreneur who thinks at a young age they're going to be such a great entrepreneur, they make millions, and then they just stop working.
Mhm.
But you know, the problem with these cats is that they have no desire for anything greater than that achievement. So when they have the leisure time, they're empty on the inside. So what's it worth, right? Like
Mhm.
that's where I think socialism and this, what I call worldview Marxism, right, which is the construction not of just political Marxism, but the construction of something bigger than that, can serve as a cause for the reintroduction of new forms of cultural production, aesthetic production, theoretical production, political organizing. You know, I don't, not necessarily saying we need to go back exactly to the situation they had in the Second International period where everything was governed by the party, right? Where like your dance recital and your men's choir and your swimming lessons were all coordinated by the Socialist Party. I don't think we necessarily need something like that, but we need something far more comprehensive than we currently have, you know. And I think that that could also be the source of something great. And we could, I don't know if self-help is the right term for it, but
No.
well, I have written actually about how the working class is using self-help that might interest you and your audience. I have an article in Ion magazine about this, because you see a lot of folks have this critique of what they call the therapeutic society.
Mhm.
And a lot of Marxists will say psychoanalysis is a form of therapeuticism, whereby you turn the therapeutic into a kind of narcissistic version of self-help, and then this becomes your form of politics. And therefore, it's a defanged anti-politics, ultimately.
Right, right.
You've heard this argument before, right? Well, part of this comes from the idea that therapy foments a kind of pacified or narcissistic individualism, and that self-help only leads to a type of you know, commodified or cheapened version of following the dictates of the market.
Mhm.
So therefore therapy is not subversive. Therapy is therefore thought to be bad for revolutionary politics or left-wing politics. And so what I actually have studied anthropologically and ethnographically, and in terms of how like millennial age working class people are actually relating to therapy, may surprise people, but one of the things that people are using therapy for, by the way, is really for overcoming generational traumas, the deaths of despair, the widespread taboos that are placed on forms of social decay and misery that the working class is not really permitted to talk about in public, because we still have a public sphere that's dominated by bourgeois interests. So in reality, when we talk about working class turning to the therapeutic, in my opinion, we should be much more humble, because there are real traumas that people need that therapy for. The question of the cheapening of that in politics is another matter. I just want to say that, because I've seen a lot of folks say this, like, oh, don't talk about these things because it's depoliticizing. It's actually not depoliticizing if people need it, especially for folks that have dealt with real issues. Do you see what I'm saying? And so I would just
No,
actually,
I
you,
couldn't agree more. We had a
please.
show that we were running. We stopped running it after October 7th for, you know, clear reasons. So much of our work just was just rerouted to focusing on that, and still is. But We had a show led by Danny Shaw,
Yeah, yeah,
Professor Danny Shaw, that was called Capitalism's Attack on the Soul. He's someone who's been through recovery, the 12-step, who still works in that field. And I think it's very clear that when we're damaged and traumatized and carrying so much baggage on a daily basis, we can't be the best warriors or socialist soldiers we can be. So there's definitely a way in which you can have a therapeuticism that is depoliticized and that draws and that functions as a form of anti-politics, as you mentioned. But I think that there has to be a better job within communist and socialist organizations at creating a space for this, because it's a form of healing people. And I mean, if you're thinking at it, if you're thinking about it, if you use a homology to the body, it's like people can fight better if they recover from their injuries. It would be foolish to say that no, actually going to physical therapy is actually a waste of time and it's gonna take you away from fighting. And no, it's gonna create the conditions so that you're better for this fight.
absolutely. No, it's true. I mean, everybody should read this book called Freud's Free Clinics, because Sigmund Freud, after the First World War, decided to open up, like every single member of Freud's inner circle completed their own psychoanalysis completely for free. The state apparatus funded free clinics to assist the working class with their internal traumas, symptoms, neuroticisms, etc. So I actually would be for the universalization of access to things like psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis is not a doctrine for the re-entrenchment of a particular bourgeois individualism. On the contrary, cognitive behavioral therapy is more so. Much more so, by the way. And we don't need to get down that rabbit hole. We can have another conversation on that. But I mean, I think to your point, on virtue, on self-help, on kind of reclaiming these things, on having a kind of constructive and positive, affirmative form of socialist activity, to reintroduce a conception of leadership that would even be based on heroism. Mao talked about the heroism of the masses. Not the heroism of the individual, but how do you tap into the heroism of the masses? It's a different category than individual heroism. How do you participate in collective heroism? Can a project have that, right? That's valid for us to talk about, That's not what people talked about in the New Left. That's not what the boomers talked about. That's not what prior generations talked about. But maybe we should.
Right. Maybe. I mean, my Marxism / Marxism-Leninism is one that I think is very informed by Hegel. And for Hegel, this concept of hero is not the traditional one of like someone who's mixed with a god. It's the person that becomes at a certain historical conjuncture, precisely because of those historical conditions, the agent of history, like the person that allows a form of expression of the concept that allows us to move forward, that allows freedom to advance.
Right.
And there's a way to materialistically interpret that from the Marxist tradition so that we can see,
right.
I mean, our heroes are heroes. Marx is a hero of mine. I have a big ass portrait of him for a reason.
Sure.
Engels, and there's also a sense in which they're heroes precisely because the masses are heroes. Mao's a hero precisely because he was able to be this unique expression of the masses, and there was this dialectical and referential relationship with the masses. So I would definitely agree with the category of like a socialist hero. I mean, in Cuba, with instead of saying like some bullshit Pledge of Allegiance like we do here in the States, you have Pioneros por el Comunismo, seremos como el Che. Pioneers for communism, strive to be like Che. That's a very clear like understanding of there's something going on here. Like this is an individual from the future, which is how they would describe Che. I think we have a few of those people in our tradition that we can uphold. The Institute puts as the fourth head of Marxism Du Bois. I think we can do something similar in terms of an individual from the future with people like King, with Winston, with many other people in our, and I think heroes, not only the direct function that they play, but what lingers is a form of image that allows the mass of people to think excellence through that type of excellence and to strive to be like. It sounds kind of corny, but I think if before any interaction online or with our comrades or with our coworkers, we like had a bracelet, kind of like how the Christians do. Instead of what would Jesus do, if we had like what would Lenin do, what would Winston do, what would MLK do? I think we'd have better outcomes in many ways. So, but to wrap it back, because we've kind of sidelined from the Nietzsche discussion. I wonder if you agree with this, but I think that I don't think the propping up of like a Nietzschean left is something spontaneous. We've discussed this before, the explicit, intentional backing of forms of compatible lefts. So how do you read that? Do you see it as these guys were just like spontaneously wrong? They were captured, enamored by Nietzsche, or do you see their popularity as something that's like artificially propped up by the State Department because it divorces us from the tradition that I think they're really scared of, which is Marxism? And to tie it into reading like a Parasite and taking components not just from Nietzsche but from any other thinker. Of course, Lenin tells us that we must that communists, I have the quote here pulled up. Let me see if I can. That communists, you become a communist only when you enrich your mind with a knowledge of the treasures created by mankind. I read that at least as taking the rational kernels from the history of the best thinkers of humanity. We have to, on the one hand, do that. Like, what if there's something in Nietzsche that can help us, and that then we can reinterpret in a more communist way, we should. But we also have at the same time a very serious problem of eclecticism that has, I think, degenerated various Marxist traditions. I think this is something that leads the Second International to go downhill. There's a very explicit abandonment of the philosophical aspects of Marxism and return to neo-Kantianism. So how do you sort of see the relationship of the political economy of knowledge that props up the sort of left Nietzscheans? And do you fear that there is a danger of like eclecticism in do you think that basically there's people that might claim to be reading a certain thing parasitically, but then what they're actually doing is just enmeshing it and ending up in a form of more eclectic position?
Yeah, I mean, I have a whole section. Two things. First off, people are asking about Carl Jung in the chat.
Oh,
Jung,
yeah.
by the way, everybody, if you're interested in Jung, I touch on his reading of Nietzsche in my book. So you got to read the book to find out what I say. Because Jung gave a series of seminars on Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
Mm-hmm.
And Jung has this brilliant idea of Nietzsche's madness, what he calls cryptomnesia, where he argued that Nietzsche would write and tap into a type of spiritual plagiarism of something that he had read many, many years prior, and then he would regurgitate it as his own. And Jung called it a form of psychosis. But Jung also said about Nietzsche, by the way, and then I'm going to get to your point, Carlos. Jung also said that Nietzsche needs to come with like a warning label on it. He recognized how politically dangerous a lot of Nietzsche's ideas actually are, by the way. Even though Jung, as a psychoanalyst, I think is a bit more problematic than Freud, precisely because Jung incorporates a lot more of Nietzsche's ideas into the structure of his psychoanalytic community, which is why there's a wonderful book on Jung and the irrationalism of Jung's philosophy as coming out of Nietzscheanism by Richard Knoll, called The Jung Cult. Everyone should check that out. Once you read that book, I think you will think differently about the incorporation of Jung for liberatory psychoanalytic practice. That's just an aside point. Look, I mean, the Bolsheviks faced the same debate. Keep in mind Bogdanov, who debated with Lenin quite a lot, philosophically, was also a proponent of Marxism and imperial criticism and a certain form of eclecticism in the world of philosophy and theory that Lenin thought dangerous to the class struggle. Nietzsche has returned once again in our time. Everyone's talking about him. Even the Sydney Sweeney thing on SNL, they're calling her a Nietzschean, whatever the hell that means. He's in the air. We're breathing him on the left and on the right. As Marxists, Nietzsche does bring a certain eclecticism into the world of theory, without question. What Lucerdo, what Lukács, and what Gramsci, also Gramsci is a great critic of Nietzsche, by the way, and others, many Marxist critics of Nietzsche bring out, first and foremost, is a way to understand the function of his concepts, that there is a kind of design. On the one hand, why? Well, precisely because of the centrality of the politics. So once we understand that, we can then respond to Nietzscheans with more clarity. Because keep in mind, for them, they want to treat him as decentered and as untimely and as indeterminate and as metaphorical. That's the kind of Deleuze, Derrida, French Nietzschean thing, also Walter Kaufmann too. So there's that dimension. The third dimension, I would say, Carlos, is let's learn how to learn better from him, which is this dialectical reading of all of these insights we've talked about tonight, where we sort of take Nietzsche's insights and we just reverse them. Then historically, we can go back and see how other Marxists have done that. Huey Newton, Jack London, Kurt Eisner. When Max Weber wrote, everyone is probably familiar with Max Weber's notion of the charismatic personality. He was actually using that as a model of this guy, Kurt Eisner. And Kurt Eisner led a successful socialist revolution in 1918 in Bavaria. Before that, like I think a decade prior to him leading this socialist revolution, he wrote a book called, I guess it's translated as something like Spiritual Psychopathy, on the spiritual psychopathy of Friedrich Nietzsche, the apostle of the future. And what he argued was that we need to take all of Nietzsche's insights and reverse them for socialism. And that's what he did. So we need to think about like along the lines of London, of Eisner, of Newton, you know, and use those models. Now, one of the things that we're dealing with is the question of worldview Marxism and the legacy of a thinker like Lukács as well. And we're dealing with the question of the legacy of our theory of class consciousness and our theory of Marxist education. It's bigger than a question of just meaning of class. You see what I'm saying? So there's a lot of philosophical questions that are emerging in our time. I think Nietzsche will crisscross and intersect with. In future conversations, we can get into the details on all of that. Because I do think that, you know, it matters for us as Marxists to have a philosophical foothold. I am for Marxism and philosophy. I think that Marxists who think that, you know, because a lot of people think that Marxist critique of philosophy means that Marxism should have nothing to say about philosophy. I disagree with that totally. And I know that you do as well.
If I didn't, my existence would be somewhat contradictory. Philosophy instructor and a Marxist. No, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's important to tackle all of these thinkers. They're in the air, as you say. And I think what you do when you obtain their insights and then reverse it in a positive form is that you also, since it's in the air, you find a way to create a point of contact with working people that might be influenced by some of this thinking. And it's a lot easier to bring someone over when you're starting on the basis of a common standpoint, a common path. And I mean, we've called that the rational kernel. Like when you have a working class person that might have, you know, drank some of the Nietzschean Kool-Aid, if you know it imminently and you're able to provide a proper Marxist reversal of it, it makes convincing, which is ultimately, I think, the central job of communists. It's a war of
Yeah.
positions. It makes it much easier than just like out front attack or having no point of contact.
Well, that's right. That's right. That's why for me, the class position of the Nietzschean, there's a tendency of the urban, dejected, fail-son middle class reader of Nietzsche. That's a type. But I'm not really somebody that believes in archetypes, because I don't think that class functions in this static way, as we've talked about before. No. I'd rather rationally engage with that type and pry them out of that structure, as opposed to discarding them. I'd rather have that contestation, that debate with them. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of these left Nietzscheans don't want to debate me. That's fine. That's fine. Maybe in time they'll be comfortable to do so. But the point is like, yeah, there's a class formation of Nietzschean readers. And Plekhanov, the great teacher of Lenin, he wrote about this. In 1905 in Russia, when they had their first revolution before the big one in 17, did you know that Nietzscheanism was like all throughout the Russian situation of the Narodniks and the Russian populists and the pre-Bolsheviks, which means that when the Bolsheviks came into force as a political force, Nietzscheanism was in the air. More
Can I
so
just
than
say something real quick? I was
Yeah.
mind blown because you cite various studies,
Yeah.
various questionnaires. You know, the percentage of working class people that just loved Nietzsche in Germany and in Russia around
Yeah.
these periods of turmoil and strong socialist struggles. It was it took me by surprise. I always assumed just that it was primarily like an academic affinity of a certain middle class.
Not at all. No, I mean, Nietzsche wrote in aphorisms. He did that as a choice to attract readers. He tried to build a cadre of readers, a community of readers. He argued that Zarathustra will be like a modern opera, right? Not only a book, right? You have to read Nietzsche to really know what I'm talking about. You can read Marx and understand half of it and feel dissatisfied. You can read Nietzsche and understand half of it and still feel satisfied. You see the point? And that's actually a problem with Nietzsche, which is that's why so many young people have this bombastic thing, because they can read it and sort of not really know what's going on, but feel a lot smarter. So in that sense, there's many people have written about this. He's an incredible stylist. It's another way we can learn from him. We can learn propaganda from Nietzsche, like reverse. He knows how to reach people. That's a skill. That's a damn good skill. So I
That's
hope
like
this conversation, has really brought this out. People can kind of look at, because part of my book is also like, how do you deal with reactionaries? Like we have this debate with Heidegger. We now know all the cards are on the table. Heidegger was a full Nazi, like not only a little bit, but a lot. So then, what do you make of this? All the cards are out on the table with Nietzsche as well. What do we make of it? My book is kind of trying to say, here's what we can do, proactively, constructively.
And that, I think, is the Marxist approach. You get all of the components there, the historical materialist situation, situating of the ideas, but also the immanent critique that is what I think, being a philosopher, you can bring to the table that perhaps Marxists and other fields would struggle with bringing about. But that what you just said about Nietzsche, the stylistic point, reminds me of why it is that we should also study people like Bernays, and people who have been extremely effective in developing bourgeois propaganda, not so that we can create the sort of propaganda that makes people, sleepy sheeps that just follow us, but just so that we have at our disposal the best tools in the war of position, with the explicit end of not making these sheeps, but making rational, autonomous individuals that follow us in a different way, in a very in a way that's embedded in this form of understanding of ethical life. Like, my purpose is tied with this purpose of the communist cause.
Yeah, the year before Nietzsche died, I'm sorry, the year before Nietzsche went mad, because like last 10 years of his life, he was kind of checked out from sort
87, right?
of life.
87, 88-ish.
88, yeah. In
Yeah.
88, he published 6 books and raised the money in order to propagate and print 1 million copies of his books, which at that time is a hell of a lot. And he had them translated in, I think, over half a dozen different languages. He was also, like playing the stock exchange in order to be his own best publicist. So at that level of his stylistics and of his publicity, that itself is miraculous, because he's trying to make himself into a philosopher who will be taken seriously for the next 2,000 years. So he sort of set himself up to be that way. Anyways, it's reading Nietzsche is a maddening experience. I just want to encourage everybody to try it out if you haven't. With this new lens that I'm trying to bring to the table, which I'm just a small fry compared to Lucerdo and Lukács. Read their books too. You'll come into an antagonistic relationship with him that can be quite productive, actually, for socialism. There's a way to read Nietzsche against the grain, where you get this surplus. Lucerdo said that Nietzsche gives us what he calls a theoretical surplus.
Mm.
And even Lucerdo says that theoretical surplus is more political content in it than what Marx gives in some cases. So you see even Lucerdo, right? And we haven't talked much about Lucerdo's Nietzsche. It's an extremely important project. He even says he can learn from Nietzsche.
Right.
Well,
this has been a very enlightening conversation. It's been very fun. I've enjoyed it a lot. It seems like the chat has enjoyed it. We have with us a little bit over 1,000 folks watching. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we go? Did I see that you're doing a new introduction for the Destruction of Reason, or did I misread?
Yeah.
On social media?
Yes. So one of the tragedies, Carlos, you know this, I'm just going to say it for folks that don't know, is Lukács is the greatest Marxist philosopher of the 20th century, in my opinion. I think it's without question. Well, a lot of academics...
we still have Ilienkov. Right? We got to get to it. I have Lukács and Ilienkov up there battling it out. Those two are...
Sure. Well, a lot of Marxists have painted a picture of Lukács, which has been falsified.
Yeah.
Which is around Stalinism, which is that he is a Stalinist and therefore he must be discarded. This is a myth on both accounts. And one of the things we're trying to do is show that his book called The Destruction of Reason, which constitutes the most thorough historical analysis of the rise of fascism in the 20th century that's ever been written, like an intellectual prehistory about where fascism really emerged from in a materialist sense, historical materialist sense. It's called The Destruction of Reason. It's recently been re-released, and we have a special issue coming out on it on my channel. I've done a whole conference on it with all these Lukácsian specialists, because one of the things that Adorno and the Frankfurt School tried to do was falsify Lukács's work. Yeah. And Adorno is responsible for a whole generation missing out entirely on Lukács. It's a tragedy. So one of the things we need to do is reintroduce people to the profundity of this philosophical system, because it's been lost to us by the academics. So this is something that we're trying to do, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I'm literally honored every time I pick up a Lukács book. I feel like I'm part of history, because his insights are that profound and that essential. So in the future, we should do more work on him. All of his late stuff is not even translated. His final period, the Budapest School, the Ontology of Social Being, his big project. None of that's translated yet,
There's two
over
chapters. I think there's 3 chapters translated of that one.
Yeah, but I think that somebody
Little
told me that's only like a sliver of it. There's actually a lot more that needs
It's
to come.
yeah, it's a very small part. The book seems because they include the table of contents in the back. It's maybe 30% of the book, and what we have in the 3 volumes, I have them back there, the little green ones, is around like 300 pages or so. So it's a massive.
Yeah, it's
I'm guessing it's around
short.
1,000 pages or so.
Everybody's got to check it out. You know, he has a Marxist critique of Heidegger. He has a Marxist
Yeah.
critique of Nietzsche. Lukács should be our guidepost in the
Yeah.
world of Marxism and philosophy. And part of my objective is simply to help remind people of our time that he exists and that this is worth engaging. It's a pretty simple request. So I'm always writing. I have a book that I've signed under contract simply about introducing people to Lukács. Okay. Not
Nice.
an academic book. It's just like for our time, for socialism. So,
Well, I know we're having you back on hopefully sometime soon to talk about the work you've done on American pragmatism and socialism.
oh yeah, I'd
It'd
love
be
to.
cool to have you back on to have just a Lukács discussion, because he's someone I value very much, and I don't want the Western Marxists taking him and kidnapping him from other, I think, Marxist traditions that have been more fruitful and that I read him as a part of.
Yes.
I think Losordo does too. Losordo says that Gramsci and Lukács are the only two considered within the Western Marxist canon that are, in his view, still faithful to Marxism-Leninism. What's an interesting piece of trivia information before we head out, the chief editorial counselor of our institute, Thomas Riggins, he actually had a letter exchange with Lukács a few times. After he finished his master's degree in philosophy, he's an 82-year-old, so he had wrote a letter to Lukács hoping to go study with him, and by that time Lukács was already older, and he said, "There's not a lot of Marxist philosophers here, but the only person I would recommend is Adam Schaff, of course, the great Polish Marxist." And he ended up never taking it up, but he did have that exchange, and I think he spoke about it to István Mészáros, the other
Mészáros. Oh
Mészáros.
yeah, who was huge with Chavez. Huge in terms of an intellectual force and inspiration. Mm-hmm. Okay, and Mészáros was Lukács' #1 student.
Mm-hmm.
We should
was
do
he a
also,
physical student of? Was he an actual? Because I heard it.
He's Hungarian.
Early when he
no,
came to the US quite young.
No, I think he physically was with him very closely, actually, because he's Hungarian, and Lukács gave him a certain authority over aspects of his archive and things of that nature, as far as I know. And Mészáros went on to become an authority on Lukács after Lukács' death, of course, as well, because Lukács lived to see the 68 uprising. You know, he lived to see the left Nietzschean turn. And there's an interview with him where he's horrified by it. It's very interesting, actually. But Lukács is a thinker of profound humility. He's born into an aristocratic family. He has the last name of von Lukács because his father was a aristocrat, like Engels, in some sense. But after he becomes a Bolshevik, he removes the von from his name, and he commits to Marxism fully, and he calls it a conversion. He says, "I was converted to Marxist-Leninism at that moment, after 1917." And he has the famous split at that moment with Max Weber. I was reading the letters between Max Weber and Lukács, and Max Weber says, "You are a traitor to your class." And Lukács responds in the letter, says, "Yes, you're damn right that I am." Pretty. I might include that in the book, actually, because Max Weber is, of course, hugely opposed to the Bolsheviks.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, the more I read Lukács, the more I find in it that it's just so incredibly valuable. I have a conference coming up in Mexico on the state, and I was reading a very, I think, underrated book of his, The Process of Democratization. And there's within it almost like an embryonic concept of what people are calling now the deep state, but from a Marxist foundation, which I hope to continue fleshing out for this conference in Mexico. But just such an insightful thinker, and I hope that that these projects, that this is something we can promote your introduction to it at some point, and I hope more stuff gets translated. I think a while back we were hoping to close down the archive, but anyways, anything you would like to plug before we head out, brother?
No, I just want to thank everybody for a rich and exciting chat I've been reading. Sorry we couldn't get to many of the questions that came up. It's an honor to be a part of this effort. And one of the things I think in a time where bridges are falling apart because of social decay, we need to be bridge builders on the socialist left, without question. I don't mean that cheesy. I mean it for real. And that's, I think, the spirit of what we're doing tonight. Aside from all of these intellectual topics and ideas, there's something for socialist organizing in talking about theory. And, and I think, Carlos, we talked about theory in a way which hopefully was pretty accessible to people. I really enjoyed it.
And I want to reiterate that, I have a background in philosophy, of course, but I think that your book is one that you don't need to be a specialist in philosophy to read, appreciate, and understand, which is a very unique quality in a book of such a level of erudition. So it's linked to the chat of the live stream, so you can go ahead and purchase your copy through that. And we'll also link the other stuff that Daniel doesn't seem too keen on promoting, his YouTube channel, which is spectacular, that I had the chance to go on a couple of weeks ago. We had a great conversation.
Everybody check out my interview with Carlos on Purity Fetish. That's amazing, at Emancipation's podcast. I do study groups as well on Marxist texts and stuff like that. So come along. We just did the Paris manuscripts, which was really interesting. And actually, Mészáros, Lukács' student, wrote the finest book on the Paris manuscripts, which is Marx's theory of alienation. Really, really excellent stuff, for example. So people can come. I mean, it's all pretty much free, for the masses, like Midwestern Marx is doing.
Excellent. Yeah, check that out. We'll link all of that to the comments of the YouTube video. Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us. Thank you to the 1,000+ people that joined us live, and to those who will be watching later. We'll head out, as we always do, with the Glorious International, and we'll see you all next time.
Stand up, all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no right. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is merely privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in song. So comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. Let no one build walls to divide us, walls of hatred nor walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. We'll live together or we'll die alone. In a world poisoned by exploitation, those who have taken, now they must give. And end the vanity of nations, we've but one earth on which to live. So come, brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The International unites the world in the song. the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. And so begins the final drama in the streets and in the fields. We stand unbowed before their armor. We defy their guns and shields. When we fight, provoked by their aggression, let us be inspired